At first, I thought I had found the love of my life until I realized love doesn't come with chains disguised as care. Or, another punchy option. She smiled, and I believed in forever, but every smile hid a quiet control I didn't see coming. From the very beginning, everything about her felt like a dream. She laughed in a way that made the world seem brighter, and her eyes held a warmth that drew him in instantly. Every word she spoke, every small gesture, seemed perfectly tailored to him, as if she could see the deepest parts of his heart. He thought he had found someone who understood him better than anyone else ever had. At first, it was exhilarating, intoxicating even. There were surprises, compliments, and moments so intimate they felt like they belonged in a movie. He never questioned it, he was too busy falling, swept away by the charm she wore like a second skin. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the colors of their perfect world began to shift. A slight criticism here, a tiny expectation there, small enough to overlook, yet persistent enough to plant a seed of doubt. When he tried to speak up, she would twist his words, making him feel guilty for feeling anything but grateful. Her love seemed to come with invisible strings, each one tugging him in a direction he didn't fully understand. And yet, he excused it, telling himself that love sometimes required sacrifice, that maybe this was just the price of closeness. He didn't see it yet, but the reality was that her affection was strategic. Every compliment had a purpose, every gesture was carefully calculated. She had perfected the art of appearing loving while slowly reshaping him to fit her desires. And he, blinded by the intensity of the connection, believed it was real. The truth was far more complicated, and it would take time, painful, disorienting time, before he realized that the love he thought he knew was something entirely different. She had a way of making him feel special, like he was the only person who truly mattered in the world. Every text, every late-night call, seemed designed to pull him closer, to make him crave her presence. She listened intently when he spoke, nodding, laughing at his jokes, remembering every tiny detail about him. At first, it felt like genuine connection, the kind of bond people search for their whole lives. He thought he had found someone who truly saw him. But beneath the warmth, there was a subtle undertone of control, so quiet he didn't notice at first. Her manipulations were small, almost imperceptible. A missed call could turn into an avalanche of guilt, a forgotten message into hours of anxious worry. She framed her demands as concern, her jealousy as love, and he, desperate to maintain harmony, apologized even when he wasn't in the wrong. She was an expert at weaving affection and expectation into a web so delicate yet strong that it became impossible to disentangle. He didn't see that the very behaviors he admired, the attention, the care, the closeness, were the tools she used to keep him tethered to her. Friends began to notice changes in him. He stopped doing things he loved, avoided arguments even when he had valid points, and constantly sought her approval. Yet, when he brought up his feelings, she would smile and say, "I'm just trying to help you," or "I care too much to ignore it." He believed her, convincing himself that the discomfort was a sign of deep love, not manipulation. Slowly, he was being pulled into a reality where his desires, opinions, and even instincts were secondary to hers. And yet, he still thought he was falling in love with her, not realizing he was falling into her control. The first cracks in his perception began almost imperceptibly, like hairline fractures in what he thought was solid ground. Small inconsistencies in her words, fleeting expressions of irritation, moments that didn't quite add up, each one planted a tiny seed of doubt. At first, he brushed them aside, convincing himself that he was overreacting, that love sometimes came with confusion. But the nagging feeling persisted, growing louder each day. He started to notice how her compliments could turn into subtle digs, how her affection often carried an unspoken expectation. It was like walking on shifting sand, he never knew when he might stumble. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that every relationship had its ups and downs, that perhaps he simply misunderstood her intentions. But late at night, when he replayed conversations in his mind, the doubts refused to be ignored. Friends had started to hint that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Their gentle warnings, at first dismissed, began to echo in his mind, making him question everything he had once taken for granted. Each day, the contrast between the person she showed the world and the subtle pressures she exerted behind closed doors became more apparent. The more he questioned, the more she seemed to tighten her hold, responding with just enough love to keep him tethered, just enough charm to keep him from leaving. It was a dangerous dance, one step forward in recognition, 2 steps back in confusion. He realized he was no longer the person he had been when they first met. He was adapting to her moods, constantly adjusting, always careful not to upset her. And the deeper he went, the more he understood that what he had believed to be love might have been manipulation all along, carefully disguised, almost impossible to recognize until it was too late. By now, the emotional tug-of-war had become exhausting, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about love. Some days, she was the sweetest person imaginable, her touch gentle, her words soothing, making him feel cherished and understood. On other days, her tone would shift, her eyes cold, her comments sharp and cutting, leaving him confused and anxious. He never knew which version of her he would encounter, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing between affection and criticism, constantly trying to anticipate her moods. The swings were subtle but relentless, each one chipping away at his confidence. He found himself apologizing for things that weren't his fault, just to calm the storm that followed a perceived slight. He began to doubt his instincts, his judgment, even his own memory, replaying interactions over and over to determine what he might have done wrong. Friends' warnings echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside, believing he knew her better than anyone else. He clung to the good moments like lifelines, hoping that the warmth he sometimes felt was proof that the love was real, not realizing it was precisely what kept him trapped. Her manipulations were deliberate, designed to keep him off balance, dependent, and constantly seeking her approval. Every display of kindness was a reward, every moment of distance was a punishment. And he, desperate for love and connection, found himself endlessly chasing the highs and tolerating the lows. The emotional roller coaster was wearing him down, but he still convinced himself that what they shared was love. He didn't yet see that the affection he clung to so desperately was part of a pattern meant to control him, to keep him entangled in a web he could barely see, let alone escape. The breaking point came quietly, almost unnoticeably at first, but when it hit, it shook him to his core. It wasn't a single argument or dramatic outburst, it was a culmination of countless small moments that had built up over months, each one adding weight until he could no longer bear it. He realized how much of himself he had given away, bending, adjusting, and excusing her behavior in the name of love. He had lost sight of who he truly was, and the thought left him hollow. The trust he once felt had been eroded by a constant undercurrent of manipulation, leaving only a fragile shell of the connection they once had. He tried to confront her, to speak openly about the confusion, the hurt, and the way he felt controlled. But she twisted his words, making him feel selfish and unreasonable, gaslighting him into questioning his own perception. The frustration and heartbreak were overwhelming, but this time, something inside him shifted. He recognized the pattern, the game, and the carefully disguised control. No longer willing to shoulder the blame or excuse the pain, he set firm boundaries, refusing to be pulled back into the cycle. For the first time, he felt a spark of clarity, a glimpse of the person he had been before her influence took hold. He understood that love should not feel like fear, anxiety, or constant compromise. The realization was liberating yet terrifying, because it meant letting go of someone he had thought he could never live without. Yet deep down, he knew this was necessary. This breaking point was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of reclaiming his power, his identity, and his understanding of what love truly should be. For the first time, he saw the manipulation for what it was, and he refused to be trapped any longer. The awakening didn't come all at once, it arrived gradually, in quiet moments of reflection and painful honesty. For the first time in months, he began to look at himself without guilt, without the heavy weight of her expectations pressing down on him. He noticed the ways he had been molded to fit her desires, how his opinions had been silenced, how his instincts had been questioned. Slowly, he reclaimed the pieces of himself that had been buried beneath the constant emotional tug-of-war. Each realization was a small victory, each boundary he set a step back toward freedom. He began to understand the true nature of her so-called love. What he had believed to be affection, attention, and care had been carefully measured to keep him dependent, to control his emotions, and to shape him to her convenience. The clarity was both bitter and liberating. He felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and relief, the anger for the manipulation he had endured, the sorrow for the time lost, and the relief that he could finally see clearly. He started setting firm boundaries, speaking his mind without fear, and prioritizing his own well-being. It wasn't easy, old habits die slowly, and her attempts to pull him back into the cycle were relentless. But he began to trust himself again, to believe in his own judgment, and to honor his own needs. He discovered that love without respect and freedom was not love at all, and that self-respect was the foundation of any genuine connection. Each day, the fog of confusion lifted a little more, revealing a path forward where he could rebuild his life on his own terms. The awakening was painful, but it was also the beginning of his true journey, one toward clarity, strength, and the understanding that real love never manipulates, it only nurtures. She noticed the change in him almost immediately, and with it came a shift in her approach. Where once her influence had been subtle and relentless, now she tried a different tactic, framing her past manipulation as love. She would smile, soft and reassuring, and remind him of the moments when she had been there for him, when she had sacrificed for their relationship. Every controlling behavior, every moment of jealousy or criticism, was now painted as proof of how much she cared. She tried to convince him that the confusion, the anxiety, and the compromises he had endured were just parts of a love that was deep and passionate, even necessary. But he no longer felt the pull of her words. He could see the pattern clearly, recognize the games, and understand the purpose behind every word and gesture. What she called love had always been about control, not connection. Her attempts to rewrite history, to convince him that her manipulation was care, only highlighted the stark difference between genuine love and self-serving affection. For the first time, he responded without fear, without guilt. He set clear boundaries, refusing to accept the distorted version of love she offered. He realized that love does not manipulate, it does not twist reality to serve one person's desires, and it does not demand submission under the guise of devotion. Her insistence that it was all love no longer had power over him. He understood that love was meant to uplift, not suffocate, to nurture, not control. And in that realization, he found strength, clarity, and a peace that she could never take from him. The illusion was gone, replaced by a truth he would never allow to be obscured again. The days after he finally saw through her manipulation were unlike anything he had experienced in years. There was a quiet freedom in simply existing without the constant pull of her expectations. He began to rediscover the parts of himself he had abandoned, his passions, his opinions, his sense of humor, and the little things that made him feel alive. Every decision he made was his own, every thought his own, and for the first time, he felt the weight of self-respect instead of anxiety or obligation. He spent hours reflecting on the relationship, dissecting the moments he had once cherished, now seen clearly for what they were. There was pain in the realization, of course, pain for the time lost, the energy drained, and the illusions he had clung to so desperately. But alongside that pain was empowerment. He understood now that love should never feel like manipulation, and that real affection builds up rather than tears down. Each day he reclaimed his autonomy, he felt stronger, more grounded, and more in tune with his true self. Friends and family noticed the change immediately. He laughed more freely, spoke with confidence, and no longer sought validation from someone who had never truly respected him. He pursued activities he loved, reconnected with old passions, and allowed himself to simply be without fear of judgment or control. The freedom he felt was intoxicating, not because it was new, but because it was authentic. By embracing his independence, he realized that healing was not about erasing the past, but learning from it, using it as a foundation to build a life defined by his choices. In this newfound clarity, he discovered the true meaning of love, both for himself and for others, rooted in respect, trust, and the freedom to be oneself fully. Life after her felt different, not in a way that was empty, but in a way that was full of clarity and purpose. He no longer carried the weight of confusion, guilt, or constant compromise. Instead, he walked through his days with a sense of self-respect that had been absent for far too long. The freedom to make his own choices, to speak his mind, and to pursue what truly mattered to him was liberating. He realized that moving on wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past, it was about learning, growing, and ensuring that the mistakes he had once made wouldn't repeat themselves. He looked back at the relationship not with bitterness, but with understanding. He saw her for who she really was, someone who disguised control as love, and he recognized how far he had come in reclaiming his own power. There was no desire for revenge, no longing to confront her or prove anything. What mattered now was his own peace and the life he was determined to build. Each step forward reinforced the lessons he had learned, the importance of boundaries, self-worth, and recognizing manipulation for what it truly is. Friends and family marveled at the change. He was lighter, more present, and more genuine in every interaction. Love, he realized, was not about possession or control, it was about mutual respect, support, and freedom. And though the scars of the past remained, they no longer dictated his emotions or choices. As he embraced this new chapter, he felt a quiet pride in himself, in his resilience, and in his ability to rise above the manipulation that had once held him captive. Moving on without regret, he finally understood that true love begins with self-love, and the journey to it was worth every moment of pain, reflection, and awakening.